Well, good evening. We'd like to welcome you to, of course, this historical building, the Lenoir High School Auditorium. If you're a true Bearcat, you'll know all about this place. So it's a great facility. We're glad to have you here. We love using this building, and we're going to try to use it many more times over the next few years as we keep continuing to plan things in this facility. But thank you for coming out tonight. We're here to talk with the State Historical Preservation Office is with us. Andy McDonald is going to come up and join me in just a few minutes, and we're going to talk about the comprehensive survey report that has been worked on for the last, how long? 6 months? 6 months. This was funded by the State Historic Preservation Office to the City of Lenoir, and we're very proud of that. And they're going tonight to present to you what this is all about and kind of give you an update on where we are with it and what we can do with this report. Quick housekeeping thing for you. If you need to use the restroom, please go through the back doors. See the gentleman there at the back door, and he will lead you to the restroom, which is down on the next level. So you'll see him. He's right at the back door. What's that? Do we have a problem? Down. I could probably do this without it, you know. All right, I'll let them figure that out. They probably talk less than I do. So anyway, I just wanted to do that. We have several key members that are here tonight, of course, and Annie's going to introduce that. I want to say thanks to Jenny Wheelock, our planning director here at the city, for all her valuable work in this. Kaylin Horn, our downtown development director. Scott Hildebrand, our city manager, is here. A couple of our council members are here. Kim Edmiston and TJ Rohr are with us in the audience, and thank you guys for being here. And several of our other staff are here, and we thank you all for all that you do in putting these things together. Annie, we'll bring you up, and you can get us going and tell us all about this great report.
And I think I probably should.
Your mouth is not as big as mine, are you?
So is it? So, okay, there we go. I won't talk as long. This one's okay? Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from Bruce in the back. So this architectural survey project started actually last December when I worked with Claudia Brown, the Survey and National Register manager in our Raleigh office, to drive the streets of Lenoir to get a better understanding of what the historic structures are here. Lenoir was surveyed in 1986, 1987 as part of a county-wide project that identified historic buildings across the county. But it didn't focus in particular on Lenoir. And in my work, I work for the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm based in Asheville in the Western Office. We cover 25 counties, so one day I might be in Boone, the next day I might be in Murphy, the next day I might be in Morganton. So we cover 25 counties and primarily work with our Architectural Survey and National Register of Historic Places programs. My colleague, Jennifer Cathy, is the restoration specialist for the same region, and she consults with property owners on the rehabilitation of historic buildings. So we've had cause over the past 5-6 years to come to Lenoir on various occasions for various projects, and as I come to Lenoir every time, I realize we don't know enough about the historic buildings here. There's not enough of an analysis of what historic buildings are important and significant and intact, and what neighborhoods really demonstrate the history and the historic development of the town. And so that led to some discussions between myself and our Raleigh staff over what can we do really to better understand the history of Lenoir, to work on a project that's beneficial for our office and that benefits the city and your residents and property owners. And so it ultimately culminated in this project. So last December, Claudia and I drove through Lenoir and kind of identified what we thought might be some survey priorities. And then in March, we contracted with Robinson and Associates to do this project. It really took off this summer. The first phase was kind of a planning phase, and that was just kind of identifying the process, how they were going to do the work, when they would be coming down. And over the course of the subsequent months, they did the architectural survey on the ground, and they may have spoken with some of you. They compiled all of the survey records, and it's in excess of 350 survey records, close to 400. They submitted those to our office, and I've reviewed them and sent feedback and comments back. And then they presented a report, a draft report that some of you may have read. We're working on processing that right now and getting feedback to the consultant. So that's the process up to this point. We selected Lenoir in part because there's so much here. There's so much history. There's so many historic buildings from throughout your history up to the present day or the late 20th century. I think the cutoff date for the survey was about 1970. But we don't know enough about it. That's why we selected Lenoir, because we knew that there was interest and energy here, but there wasn't real, things weren't quite coming together. So we said, this is a project we will fund, and it will benefit both the city and our office as we continue to consult in Lenoir. So following on the heels of all the on-the-ground survey and the preparation of the draft report, the consultant, Robinson and Associates, is here to do the presentation on the survey results. Keep in mind that this is not going to be a detailed explanation of all of the historic properties in the city. This is kind of an overview. I think we have about an hour. Daria Gasparini is a principal at Robinson and Associates. It's a research and consulting firm specializing in architectural, landscape, and cultural history. Daria has more than 15 years of historic preservation experience and is fully qualified as an architectural historian, according to the definition by the Secretary of the Interior. She specializes in historic property research and documentation, National Register and National Historic Landmark nominations, and determinations of eligibility, historic structures reports, and cultural landscape evaluations. She and her firm hold a strong record of success in environmental review under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and consulting with numerous federal and local historic preservation review agencies. Her diverse portfolio of projects includes the U.S. Chancery in Athens, Greece, designed by Walter Gropius, the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. And Daria will be presenting the summary results of the survey project.
Thanks, Annie. Annie briefly touched on this, but I'd like to start with a brief statement about the methodology for the project. Following state guidelines, our survey project was divided into two phases, the planning phase and the survey phase. The planning phase kicked off in April 2017 and included several key tasks, and this included reviewing existing survey records, coordinating with Annie and other members of the State Historic Preservation Office, meeting with local city officials and members of the local survey committee, and initial research. And then the next phase was our survey phase, and that's really boots on the ground. We identified the resources to be surveyed based on the Historic Preservation Office's windshield survey map, which you can see shown here, one part of it. And then we did all of our field work and the preparation of the survey files. And then this phase concluded with the preparation of a final report, which Annie had mentioned. This is in draft form. So briefly on the research, sources were varied and included the Caldwell County Tax Office and Register of Deeds for deeds and plat maps, the Caldwell Heritage Museum Historic Photograph Collection. We have Bill Tate to say a big thank you for sharing his collection with us. The local history room at the Caldwell County Public Library, where we reviewed newspapers, city directories, family histories, local history books, and other records. And other sources for historic photographs, postcards, maps, drawings, and other primary source records included the North Carolina State Archives and Library, the North Carolina Collection at UNC Chapel Hill, and the North Carolina Western Regional Archives in Asheville. Digitized resources, including the North Carolina Architects and Builders database, were really helpful, as was the North Carolina Modernist Houses website. And just to give you a brief overview of the types of things that we were looking at, we have historic postcards, Sanborn maps, old plat maps, of course historic photographs, and then architectural and landscape records as well. So fieldwork occurred over the course of about 7 days, and a little bit in May, and then the bulk of it in June and July. And while in the field, myself and 2 team members completed field data forms for each resource. We took photographs and completed sketch maps, and in some cases, we interviewed homeowners. The field data forms, such as the one shown here, were used to record individual structures. We also use these to update records on previously recorded structures and to document neighborhoods or other umbrella areas containing groups of associated resources. And these umbrella areas were, for the most part, neighborhoods. We recorded data on style, construction, materials, notable building features, and other characteristics of the properties. Each structure and umbrella area was also assigned a unique site survey number, and this will then be used to integrate our survey data into the statewide inventory. So before I dive too far into the details of our findings, I'd like to briefly address the scope of our project. We focused mainly on areas outside the downtown historic district, which was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2007, and then there was a survey boundary increase in 2013. So this area has been well documented, and as have several other historic properties that are already listed as individual resources on the National Register, and this includes properties such as the Edgar Allan Poe House and Lenoir Grammar School. Instead, our survey focused on Lenoir's residential neighborhoods, industrial sites, and the institutional and commercial buildings outside the downtown historic district. We also resurveyed over 24 buildings that were recorded as part of the Caldwell County survey that took place in the late 1980s. And those were the records that needed updated information and photography. So at the conclusion of the survey phase, our team generated individual survey files for a total of 363 buildings. This number includes new survey and survey updates. And you can see from the chart the types of buildings that were documented, and this is based on their historic function. And as you can see, the majority of the buildings were residential. And the residential category included 1 duplex, 3 apartment buildings, and then all the rest were single-family homes. And the industrial category included some warehouses, and the last category, other, includes buildings such as the Sheriff Department, Fairfield Cemetery, an elementary school, the fire station, and 2 American Legion posts, among many other different building types. So in addition to the 363 individual survey files, we documented dozens of other resources in about 20 umbrella areas. And the best way to kind of describe these or show you where we surveyed is the windshield survey maps. The areas called out in turquoise were identified by the State Historic Preservation Office, and then over the course of our work, we identified a few other areas. So this included areas such as Norwood Street, Lower Creek Drive, Emerald Place, Lakeside Terrace Circle, and several others you can see here. So in those areas, we didn't look at every single building in these areas. We chose a few properties to survey that were kind of indicative of the style and character of the area. So now we'll get to the nuts and bolts of the presentation. I'll present an architectural history of Lenoir using existing buildings and structures as examples. I'll touch upon the major historical themes and chronological periods that shaped the development of the city and review its built environment within these contexts. So the first broad phase of development encompasses the colonial period through the arrival of the railroad. We won't jump that far ahead. Caldwell County's first colonial settlers came to the area in the 1760s from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. These settlers were attracted to the area's abundant natural resources, its temperate climate, and its rich soil. The North American Land Company was an early land trust that owned hundreds of thousands of acres in North Carolina, and they promoted the region in an advertisement that read, quote, "And the lands, when cultivated, produce the most abundant crops of Indian corns, wheat, rye, barley, oats, peas, beans, and potatoes, and every species of garden vegetables, as well as all kinds of vines and fruit trees." It was quite a ringing endorsement. So these early settlers planted crops and raised livestock, and some, such as Elias Powell, built mills for grinding wheat and corn. The Powell family played a key role in the early development of Lenoir. In 1891, when Lenoir was established as the seat of the newly formed Caldwell County, the first meeting of the county court took place in a store owned by Elias's son, George Powell. Around the year 1834, George Powell's son, another Elias, built a house on part of his father's land, which still stands today at 807 Lower Creek Drive. You can see that here. It's a two-story wood frame house with end chimneys and rear additions. And although changes have been made to the house over the years, including the addition of a one-story wraparound porch with a projecting pedimented entrance bay, which you can see here, the house still retains its original two-room plan and is an important example in Lenoir of early 19th century domestic architecture. These single-pile two-room plans, you can see here, are known as hall parlor houses, and they were built from the early colonial period through the 1900s. In the case of the Powell house, both of the main rooms were heated with fireplaces, and the house today stands as significant as a vestige of the area's antebellum settlement patterns when pioneers established homesteads along the fertile bottomlands of the creeks and streams. As a result of a new state constitution in 1833 and the passage of legislation that was favorable to Western growth, new counties were delineated throughout North Carolina's Piedmont and Mountain regions. In 1841, Caldwell County was formed from Burke and Wilkes counties, and Lenoir was established as the county seat. The town was named after General William Lenoir, who came to the Blue Ridge foothills from Brunswick County, Virginia, after serving in the Revolutionary War. Lenoir was established on the site of Tucker's Barn, a tavern run by William Tucker that sat at the intersection of two main high roads and served as a general assembly area for the region. In 1939, William Tucker had sold his land to General Lenoir, who, along with James Harper and Seth Bradshaw, donated the property that would be consolidated to create the town. And you can see Lenoir was laid out on a grid plan. You can see that here on this map dated 1841, that placed the courthouse in the central square created by notching out the corners of the adjacent blocks. You can see that here. This plan is called the Lancaster Square after a town in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the site of its first documented use. During this early period of Lenoir's development, residents built houses and merchants established shops on the streets surrounding the courthouse, and homesteads spread out over the surrounding hillsides. Most of the domestic buildings erected after the founding of Lenoir were vernacular in form and style. Today, few examples from this period survive. The Reverend Jesse Rankin House at 313 Ridge Street, originally built in around 1843, is a surviving example of log construction in Lenoir. In the late 1830s, James Harper, a prominent merchant and civic leader, built a church on his homestead, which was known as Fairfield, and shortly after donated it to the Methodist Episcopal Church. The grounds of the church served as a cemetery. Prior to the development of municipal cemeteries, churchyards, as well as small graveyards on family farms, were typical early American cemetery forms. Some of Caldwell County's earliest settlers were interred at Fairfield Cemetery, and slaves were buried in unmarked graves in the back section of the grounds. After the Methodists ceased to use Fairfield Church as it became known, it was used as a school. And although the former church building was torn down in the 1880s, burials continued in the cemetery until the early 20th century. Today, Fairfield Cemetery, which is located between Spring Street and Beale Street on the east, is an important example in Lenoir of an early 19th century churchyard cemetery. So now we'll move on to the next major period of development, which we've titled Industrial and Economic Growth, and it's the period between 1884 and 1920. The arrival of the railroad in western North Carolina ended a long period of isolation for Lenoir and similar towns that were rendered largely inaccessible by the region's geography. The opportunities for economic growth created by rail transit transformed Lenoir from a small crossroads community to a leading regional industrial and manufacturing center. Between 1890 and 1920, Lenoir's population grew from 673 to 3,718 residents. New neighborhoods sprang up around production and manufacturing facilities and along principal transportation corridors. So for each period of development moving ahead, we'll look first at industrial architecture, and then at commercial and institutional architecture, and then finally we'll turn to the residential architecture. The Lenoir Furniture Company, established in 1889 and operated by John Matthias Bernhardt, was the county's first furniture company. Its factory was located on a site below Prospect Street along the Carolina Northwestern Rail Line, which generally ran in a southwest-northeast direction west of the Courthouse Square and the commercial district. George Washington Finley Harper, one of the three children of James Harper, succeeded J.M. Bernhardt as the company's president shortly after its founding. And the company struggled for its first decade, with the factory laying idle for 3 years. But after financial restructuring, operations resumed in 1900 as the Harper Furniture Company. So Sanborn maps show us that by 1902, the Harper Furniture Company facility consisted of a series of interconnected buildings set in a linear arrangement west of the rail tracks. You can see that in this map here. So we're focusing on this area. At the head of the complex were the dry kilns. You can see those here. And then following the organization of the production line, there was a cabinet and woodworking shop, a varnishing, finishing, packaging building, and a terminal warehouse and shipping facility. And then north of the Harper site was a large lumber yard and planing mill owned by the Wilson Lumber and Milling Company, and that's up here. Sanborn maps are such a wonderful resource for architectural historians. They were produced for insurance reasons, and they recorded highly detailed building information. And they note, for example, construction materials. You can see red here for brick and yellow for frame buildings. They tell us the number of stories of the buildings, the height of the firewalls, and much more information. The 1921 Sanborn map on the right illustrates development on the Harper plant site by that date, and you can see several new buildings, including a brick office building here and a mirror storage building adjacent to it, and then these are frame and iron warehouses down here. So you can see the change in 20 years or so. In 1929, the Harper Furniture Company and its factory were purchased by Thomas H. and Edgar and Ed Broyhill, who operated the Lenoir Furniture Corporation and the Lenoir Chair Company, respectively. Their partnership would form the basis for what would become Broyhill Furniture. Although Broyhill Furniture Industries owned the plant for much of its existence, the complex is commonly known as the Harper plant for its earlier occupation by the Harper Furniture Company. And despite demolition, new construction, and other changes to the plant over time, throughout its history, the facility has been organized according to a consistently similar program we found. Dry kilns at the head of the complex led into the various workshops, with the process ending at the warehouse. The current warehouse at the south end of the site, this is an interior picture, an exterior photo. It dates to 1940, and it's constructed with heavy timber posts and beams. And a tunnel carries the plant's conveyor system between the warehouse and the adjacent building to the north. A staircase in the cabinet shop machine room, shown here, is unusual for its 4 to 5 inch risers, a specification reportedly requested by Ed Broyhill himself. So this map shows Lenoir city limits in 1913 with the downtown area outlined in red. And as we can see here, by the early 20th century, development circled the downtown area, and it extended along the roads entering the city from the north and the south, and then it generally followed the route of the railroad tracks. So during this period, Lenoir's manufacturers, its furniture makers, its mills, its veneer companies, among others, accumulated rapidly along the Carolina Northwestern line, reaching as far as what is now Morganton Boulevard on the south. The trains entering Lenoir from the north first passed by the lumber yard, and then the Harper Furniture Company plant, and then they continued south, and they passed wholesale grocer, the Lenoir Rolling Mills complex, and 2 manufacturers of cotton yards, the Steel Cotton Mill Company and the Lenoir Cotton Mills. The Ethel Chair Company, later Fairfield Chair, appeared next, right around here, and followed by the 1-story frame building housing Lenoir Mirror Company and the sprawling complexes of Kent Coffee Manufacturing and Lenoir Furniture Corporation, later Broyhill. So rounding the bend, the tracks passed the Hudson Veneer Company, the Lenoir Veneer Company, and the Bernhardt Chair Company. And then finally, before leaving the city, they passed by the Lenoir Chair Manufacturing Company and Caldwell Furniture. In addition to the expanding manufacturing base, Lenoir's growing prosperity during the first decades of the 20th century was reflected in a renewed downtown district and substantial infrastructure improvements. Rapid changes during this period transformed downtown Lenoir. The city built a public school on Main Street in 1903. It replaced its first courthouse with the Classical Revival Building in 1904 and provided electric power in 1906. It tore out obsolete fencing, graded streets, and converted the main square into a traffic circle in 1910. Commercial buildings, some designed by prominent regional architects, took the place of houses near the center of town. The Romanesque Revival Lenoir building on West Avenue, designed by the Charlotte firm Hook and Rogers and completed in 1907, exemplified this trend. New churches built during this period included the First United Methodist Church, located at the corner of Church Avenue and Ash Avenue. Built in 1917, the impressive dome neoclassical edifice was designed by architect C.M. Carleton. When it was built, the Lenoir News Topic called it one of the finest buildings in the city. So turning now to residential architecture, for most of the 19th century, the citizens of Lenoir lived within a few blocks of the commercial district, centered on the Courthouse Square, or along the main transportation corridors leading into the city, including what is now Lower Creek Drive and Main Street. As the city grew, these areas became more densely developed and new architectural styles and building forms were introduced. In addition, new pockets of housing emerged, each scattered with grocery stores, boarding houses, and other small commercial enterprises. As would be expected in a town so closely linked to the lumber industry, most of the residential architecture constructed during this period was light frame construction. Vernacular forms such as the 2-story single-pile I-house were common. An example is this shown here at 443 High Circle. Single pile just refers to houses that are 1 room deep, and the name I-house derives from the fact that it was a common form in the rural areas of Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, although its use was certainly not limited to those areas. So here you see a typical I-house. The Queen Anne style was also popular in Lenoir, as it was throughout the United States between 1880 and the first decade of the 20th century. The style is characterized by an asymmetrical, irregular floor plan under a multifaceted roof, It typically has extensive porches, typically ornamented with elaborate spindle work, large windows, and textured wall surfaces. The house at 523 Vance Street, which records indicate likely dates to the first decade of the 20th century, is an excellent example of the Queen Anne-style decorative devices applied on a compact domestic form. During this period, large numbers of simple frame dwellings were built near Lenore's mills and factories to house laborers and their families. Along the ridge that overlooked the Bernhardt planing mill and box factory and the Lenore cotton mill was a cluster of early 20th century workers' housing. This area, which became known as Cotton Mill Hill, comprised what is now Spainhour Street and Underdown Avenue. Like many mill villages in North Carolina, the houses built for Lenore's mill workers conformed to the house plans described and illustrated in Daniel Tompkins' textbook, Cotton Mill Commercial Features, published in 1899. You can see an illustration from his book here of a house that could be built for $325, and you can see nearly an identical form below on Underdown Street. Despite alterations and with modern building materials and teardowns, Cotton Mill Hill still retains strong association with its history as a mill housing neighborhood. In contrast with areas such as Cotton Mill Hill, some parts of Lenore remain rural in character and sustained small farms well into the 20th century. One of the earliest houses on Torrance Circle, dating to 1911, is located at 132 Torrance Circle. John C. McMillan, a farmer, built the house and occupied it for over 4 decades. It is a one-story frame dwelling with a gable front and wing plan under a cross-gable roof. As typical of this vernacular house form, which was used frequently in Lenore, it has a shed roof porch located with the L made by the wings, you can see here. Another example of this form can be found just down the street at 118 Torrance Circle. And in fact, this house form is very similar to some of the mill housing built in Cotton Mill Hill, which speaks perhaps to its popularity during this period in the early 20th century. While most housing during this period was built along the transportation corridors or clustered around industrial areas, at least one early residential development appeared, Oakview. Now considered part of Mayhill Park neighborhood, Oakview was located southeast of the downtown district and developed on land that was once part of the plantation called Oak Lawn, owned by Joseph Caldwell Norwood and his wife Laura Lenore Norwood. And you can see, whoops, it's this area here. The Oakview development was financed by the Caldwell and Watauga Land and Timber Company, which was formed in 1888. The corporation platted approximately 36 acres, encompassing what is today the northeastern part of Mayhill Park. On April 4th, 1888, the Lenore News Topic reported, "The land lies splendidly. Most of it is well wooded, and there are a great many beautiful building sites upon it. The company will go to work at once, clearing out the underbrush, laying out streets and avenues, and dividing the property into lots and squares." The page shown here from the Caldwell County Deed Index lists the deeds in Oakville that were granted by the Caldwell and Watauga Land and Timber Company. And one early resident of the development was C.B. Harrison, a local merchant, who built a 2-story single-pile dwelling on a large sloping lot along College Avenue in the late 19th century. And then over the years, numerous expansions and additions were made to the house, reflecting different architectural styles and trends. Another residential development platted during this period was Rectory Hill, which would also later become known as part of the Mayhill Park neighborhood. Rectory Hill encompassed approximately 12 acres of land along Mulberry Street that was once owned by St. James Church, whose rectory once stood at the corner of what is now Rectory and College Avenue. Sometime before 1911, we don't have the exact date, the area was surveyed and platted, and the lane that led to the rectory was widened and deeded to the city, which became Rectory Street. In 1911, Mark and Mary Squires purchased 4 contiguous lots on Rectory Hill, on which they built a notable 2-story house. It features a remarkable full-height entry porch with a pedimented roof and paired ionic columns. The area was then resurveyed in 1952, and the plat map was sent to the city. So the Squires house, I believe, is built on these 4 lots. So moving on to the next phase of development, 1920 to 1945, The 1920s were a prosperous time in the nation and in Lenoir, where the expansion of local industries created new jobs that attracted growing numbers of people to the area. Despite the economic collapse of the Great Depression, by 1945, Lenoir supported 15 large manufacturing plants, 2 veneer plants, 2 mirror plants, 1 paper box and packing materials concern, and several other businesses that supplied materials for the furniture industry. Lenoir and its surrounding area also had 7 cotton mills and a large clothing factory. Added to this were hosiery mills, machine shops, flour mills, sawmills, and other industries. The city's population rose from 3,700 in 1920 to 7,598 just 2 decades later. And Greater Lenoir numbered over 13,000 by 1945. The industrial site at 1331 Harper Avenue, now the Fairfield Chair Company, was established in 1906 by the Blue Ridge Bobbin and Handle Company, later the Blue Ridge Bending Company. And this company specialized in producing parts for furniture factories. In 1906, it constructed a 1-story frame building on a site along the rail line south of West Harper Avenue. Manufacturing on the site shifted to furniture production by 1912. That is when the Blue Ridge Bending Company was purchased by M.L. Cornwell and Bert Stone and became the Ethel Chair Company. The plant changed hands one final time in 1921 when the Fairfield Chair Company was established. By 1927, additions have been added to the north facade of the original building. See that here. And the drying kiln had been doubled in size. And then later, a small frame house was constructed on the corner of Harper and Light Street to serve as an office for the company. It's no longer extends here. So by 1949, the 2-story finished product warehouse was constructed on the west end of the site, down here. And and a lot of the growth by the mid-20th century required even further building enhancements. Today, the plant includes a main factory building, an office building, drying kilns, and the design center, which was formerly a cafeteria. The property is an important example of Lenoir's industrial heritage that embodies the development of the furniture industry from the early 20th century until today. Now we'll look briefly at the early development of the site that's now Bernhardt Plant Number 1. In 1908, Bernhardt acquired a majority interest in the Moore Furniture Company and consolidated it with his planing and box mill to create the Bernhardt Manufacturing Company. And the focus of this business was dining room and bedroom furniture. So it was likely around this time that construction began on the site that is now known as Bernhardt Plant Number 1. The 1913 Sanborn map for the area depicts several buildings on the site, including 2 brick drying kilns. And again, you always know the brick buildings because they're colored red on the Sanborn maps. A brick boiler building, and 2 large rectangular frame buildings that stood across from one another on either side of the railroad spur. And then you can also note the row of 7 workers' housing that was just up the hill from the plant. A fire in 1926 burned down much of the plant, according to Bernhardt Company history, and only the brick kilns and the boiler house remained. A new manufacturing plant was constructed before the end of 1927 on the north side of the spur, and then at some point between 1927 and 1950, we don't have the exact date, several other changes on the site occurred. The workers' housing came down, and a restaurant and storage buildings were built on the hill, and then the office building was expanded. You can see that, the difference here and here. In addition, in 1936, a furniture warehouse was built south of the railroad tracks, which is now still part of the existing Plant Number 1. And we're going to come back to this property a little bit later when we talk about the Lenoir's post-World War II development. In addition to the commercial enterprises that populated Lenoir's downtown historic district, small businesses capitalized on the town's growth and flourished during this period. As part of our survey, we looked at several commercial buildings along West Harper Avenue, and businesses in this area historically catered to neighborhood residents, and it included grocery stores, filling stations, an auto repair shop, and a boarding house. The former service station at 1605 West Harper on the top left was constructed in 1923, And a unique feature of the building is the square tower that rises above the central bay of the front facade. A more typical example of commercial architecture of this period is the two-story brick building at 1528 West Harper. It has load-bearing masonry walls, a parapet roof, brick corbelling, and storefront windows. 1540 West Harper was built in 1939 and initially operated as the Torrance service station. And just down the street at 109 Virginia Street is a small one-story brick grist mill that was built in 1920. The West Lenoir Elementary School on Maple Drive was completed in 1935, and it was built using funding provided through the Federal Public Works Administration. The original building had classrooms for 12 teachers, a principal's office, a library, and an auditorium that had seating for 500. And a 4-room addition was built on the south in 1951 to meet increasing demand for classroom space, and you can see the difference here. The St. Francis Assisi Catholic Church, just across the street from us, was built in 1936 by A.J. Berner, a building contractor out of Asheville. The sanctuary was designed by Frederick Necker of New York City, and Necker also likely contributed the bas-relief over the main entrance, as his signature is visible on the stone. The church is an excellent example of the Art Moderne style applied to religious architecture. It is built of rough granite blocks with limestone trim, and at the front of the church, the parapet wall extends high above the peak of the gable to form a lobed tower topped with a cross. And also a nice feature are the doors that feature these elaborate strap hinges and wrought iron hardware. Another church built during this period was the Mount Pilgrim Baptist Church on Willow Street. The oldest part of the church, the eastern section, was constructed in 1924, replacing an earlier building on the site. It has a steeply pitched front gable roof flanked by pyramidal steeples. In 1976, the church purchased the neighboring West End School, an African-American graded school built in 1927. Likely soon after the purchase of the school, the church then constructed an intermediary building connecting the two structures. This part here. Historically, the West End was an African-American neighborhood, and Sanborn maps indicate a period of tremendous growth in the area between 1921 and 1927. The West End was located just up the hill from the Broyhill Harper plant and other manufacturers, making it an attractive neighborhood to many laborers and their families. In addition to the Baptist Church and the West End School, community gathering places included American Legion Post on Hill Street and a local ballpark named Giant Stadium, which no longer exists. The community house on Harper Avenue was constructed between 1933 and 1935 by the Lenoir Rotary Club, using labor provided by the Civil Works Administration, a program of the New Deal. The Civil Works Administration recommended that community centers such as this be constructed using native materials, such as stone or logs. And today, the community house stands as a unique example in Lenoir of rustic revival style architecture. The single-family homes built during this period in Fairfield, Mayhill Park, Freedman, Kentwood, and other neighborhoods in Lenoir embraced the broad spectrum of residential forms and architectural styles popular in suburban communities throughout the United States in the second quarter of the 20th century. The houses ranged from modest craftsman-style bungalows and period cottages to more elaborate colonial revival styles. These houses were almost universally frame structures with wood or brick cladding and asphalt shingle roofs. Stucco or stone cladding was used less frequently and limited to certain styles. Due to Lenoir's rolling terrain, many houses were banked into the slopes, allowing for basement-level garages. One neighborhood developed during this period was Freedman, a historically African-American neighborhood located northeast of downtown district. Our survey focused on Finley Avenue and the residential streets of Hewlin Place and Hartley Place. We learned that initial development of Hartley Place started after 1923, when R.B. Hartley's property south of Finley Avenue, which was then called Cemetery Avenue, was subdivided and platted into 19 lots, as shown on this plat map here. Initially called Fairview Street, the street was later renamed Hartley Place after the original landowner. One of the oldest houses on the street is 513 Hartley Place, which was built in 1926. It features a half-width front porch and a gabled dormer. It was once the house of blues musician Clyde Pop Ferguson, whose parents, Nora and Gordon Ferguson, purchased the house on lot 17 in 1940. And I think this is 17 here. For the purposes of discussing residential styles and forms, I'm going to focus on the architecture of Mayhill Park, which displays a wide range of domestic styles typical of this period. The subdivision of Mayhill Park was surveyed and platted in 1924 by the Buffalo Power Company, a land development company chartered in 1919 by Thomas Broyhill, his brother Ed Broyhill, and Roby Sylvester Crisp. The subdivision was located on a large tract of land previously owned by the Norwood family, and it encompassed what is today Highland Avenue and parts of Norwood Street, High Brighton Avenue, and Penton Avenue. And Mayhill Park abutted the older subdivisions that I discussed previously of Oak View and Rectory Hill. And perhaps in an effort to differentiate Mayhill Park from its counterparts, the Buffalo Power Company had a large masonry archway built on Norwood Street to mark the entrance to the subdivision from the north. Although the archway no longer stands today, evidence of the gateway entrance to Mayhill Park can still be seen in the change in character of the tree lawns and sidewalks right around 401 Norwood Street. And you can see how the tree lawns are much smaller in the older section of Mayhill Park and become much broader in the 1924 subdivision. In communities across the nation during this period, the craftsman style peaked in popularity. This style, influenced by the arts and crafts movement, emphasized simple, informal floor plans and rustic detailing. Craftsman style bungalows typically used natural materials, such as stone or wood shingles, and featured sheltering roof lines and inviting porches. The bungalow houses were sold by catalogs and offered detailed architectural plans for a small fee, which had an important role in democratizing the process of home building. The two-story bungalow at 416 High Brighton on the top right was built in 1923 by James and Joyce Hogan. James Hogan was the co-owner of the Hogan-Laxton grocery store and then the owner of the Appalachian Poster Advertising Company. The house has a wonderfully complex roofline that features multiple low-pitched, overlapping front gables and deep eaves and exposed rafters typical of the style. Another popular small house form is the period cottage, which began to appear in suburban developments in the 1930s and 40s. This house type is characterized by 1 and 2.5 story side gable form, typically with an off-center front-facing gables and facade chimneys. Most period cottages were brick and featured decorative brickwork or stone detailing, and arch-headed features were common. More elaborate examples used stone veneer and featured elements such as wing walls and side porches. Here are 3 examples in brick, stone, and what was originally wood siding. The Colonial Revival was the most prominent residential style in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And Colonial Revival homes in Lenoir, as elsewhere, featured elements borrowed from Georgian and federal buildings, and typically had pedimented entrances and entry porches, elaborate doorways and window treatments, plain or decorated cornices, pilasters, and roof balustrades. In form, this style emphasized symmetrically arranged, typically 2-story massing under side-gabled or hipped roofs. The 2-story brick house at 411 Highland features skintled or weeping masonry joints, an effect used to give texture to the facade. We saw several examples of this technique in Mayhill Park. While the Colonial Revival examples shown on the previous slides all featured 2-story side gable forms, here are several other iterations of the style. We have 1-story forms on the top, and at the bottom here we have a 2-story form with a front gable. Although not employed very frequently, as frequently as the Colonial Revival style, the Tudor, Spanish Revival, and other Romantic Revival styles were also built in Lenoir's residential enclaves. The Demet House, here on the left, at 401 Highland, is an example of the French eclectic style. It was built in 1939 and designed by the Winston-Salem firm of Northrop and O'Brien. And a fine example of the Spanish Colonial Revival is at 211 Mulberry Street. And typical of this style, it features a low-sloped barrel tile roof, casement windows, an arcaded porch, and this time along the back patio, stucco walls, balconies, and decorative tiles at the entrance. So now we're moving into the last section of the presentation, post-war development, 1945 to 1975. The period after World War II was a prosperous one for many of Lenore's furniture manufacturers. A national demand for home and office furnishings allowed companies to expand and diversify. Like many cities across the United States, Lenore experienced a suburban housing boom that was fueled by several factors: increased automobile ownership, advances in building technology, including prefab methods, and the availability of low-cost long-term mortgages. Lenore's city limits expanded as streets and avenues extended outward, and this opened up new land for subdivision and created fringe areas with lower densities. These developments created a suburban landscape that was entirely dependent on the automobile. So we'll turn back to, I spoke previously briefly about the early development of what is now Bernhardt Plan Number 1. And if you remember, there was a fire in 1926 that destroyed a lot of the earliest buildings on the site. And in 1927, a new factory was built north of the rail spur. And just for context, this is the existing site, and the rail spur came right here. So the factory housing was at one point over here. While the 1927 building no longer stands, the warehouse built in 1936 south of the spur is still extant, and that's this section here. It's constructed with wood floors, wood columns and beams, and brick exterior walls with metal-framed windows. As did many other companies, the Bernhardt Furniture Company entered into a particularly prosperous period in the years after World War II. And in the 1950s and 60s, it built several new plants or renovated its existing plants. And the latter is the case with Plant Number 1, where the company built an addition on the south side of its existing warehouse, this section here. The building is clad with a combination of running bond brick veneer and corrugated sheet metal. And typical of the industrial construction during this period, the interior has steel columns and beams with metal truss systems supporting concrete floors. So we'll also turn briefly to Plant 5 and Plant 3, which we also surveyed. So initial construction at what is now Bernhardt Plant 5, which is at 1904 Morganton Boulevard, was completed in 1957. So this is an example of the post-war development. The following year, the building was expanded to the north with the construction of the drying kilns, which you can see the back part of the drying kilns here. And at the end of 1958, the plant had an L-shaped plan. And then again, in the 1960s, they made another addition that nearly doubled the plant's square footage. And today, Bernhardt Plant 5 includes a 2-story central warehouse at the plant's southernmost end, which is more recent construction. In 1964, Bernhardt obtained a 75% stock in the High Brighton Furniture Company, which occupied the former Lenore chair manufacturing site at 1504 Morganton Boulevard. And proximity to its Plant 1 allowed Bernhardt to more easily integrate the High Brighton site into its operations. So from autumn 1966 into the following spring, the company undertook a comprehensive building program at the facility, which would become what is now Plant 3. And a majority of the older existing buildings on the site were demolished, except for a lumber storage building northwest of the rail spur, which was built in 1946. And you can see that's this 1946 building here. This is all post-war development. So in addition to modernizing their production facilities during this period, Lenore's furniture companies also developed professional sales forces and commissioned new corporate offices and showrooms, often using contemporary architectural styles and forms. Paul Broyhill found inspiration in the work of internationally renowned architect Edward Durrell Stone for the design of the company's new headquarters and showroom on Blowing Rock Boulevard, which was completed in 1966. When time came to design the building, Broyhill traveled to New York to meet with Stone, and finding the architect's fees higher than he was willing to spend, he was given an unpublished brochure of Stone's designs. And he took these designs back to his furniture designer, who then drew up the plans for his building. And comparing the top and the bottom images, you can see how the Broyhill showroom resembles one of Stone's most famous buildings, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. They both have this long, low profile, the attenuated columns, which are hard to see in this image, but here you see them, and the full-height glazed panels. The Fairfield Chair Company showroom on Hickory Boulevard, now the Civic Center, was built in 1970, and it was designed by John Irwin Ramsey. And Ramsey was born in Salisbury, North Carolina, and studied architecture at UNC and at Yale. And he was a strong proponent of modern architecture and designed many award-winning projects. His design for the Fairfield Chair Showroom featured a highly innovative form composed of massive cantilevered concrete slabs. You can see that in this historic photo here, resting on pedestals faced with natural stone, and site features wrapped around and under the main building racks that really work to integrate architecture with the landscape. We also surveyed a few smaller commercial buildings from this period and learned that during the immediate post-war period, the intersection of Penton and Harper Avenues, just down the streets from Smith Crossroads, developed as a small commercial district. The 3 one-story brick buildings were built at the intersection between 1945 and 1948. When the building at 106 Penton Avenue and across the street at 109 Penton Avenue were designed for they were designed for the automobile age with these setbacks and parking in front. The storefront across the street was reflected earlier commercial forms. And this is also interesting. The curved facade and marquee of 109 Penton Avenue exhibits an art moderne design influences rendered in brick. So we also surveyed a few other small commercial buildings. The City Service Cleaners and Laundry building, which was constructed in 1947, and a historic postcard dating probably from the 50s or 60s shows the building's original polychromatic exterior cladding and its distinctive semi-octagonal metal awning. And just down the street at 1047 Harper Avenue is the Southern Bell Telegraph and Telephone Company building, which was built in 1951 and features less exuberant design. As more and more residents of Lenoir came to rely on automobiles for their commute, pockets of residential development were built farther from downtown. Lower density areas, such as Lakeside Terrace, provided more privacy and larger yards. These neighborhoods offered Lenoir's growing middle class a distinct alternative to older residential areas, which were often clustered around mills and industrial sites. So we looked at many of these communities, and I'm just using Lakeside Terrace as an example tonight. It's located just outside Hickory Boulevard in South Lenoir, and a large part of its housing stock dates from the 1960s. One of the developers of the area was Reuben Drum, the owner of Drum's Drive-In Theater, who purchased 16 acres from John McLean in 1959, and then he subdivided it into residential lots. And he placed restrictions on the types of houses that could be built in the area. The exterior of the residence had to be brick, rock, or wood, and exteriors of cinder block and asbestos were prohibited. And contractor Ben Pope of Pope Builders purchased several lots and built houses on them, including 2324, 2325, and 2327 Lakeside Terrace Circle, among others. And the area is characterized by split level and ranch style houses constructed with brick veneer and a combination of brick and siding. And the ranch houses have this typical low profiles and attached garages or carports. Several notable regional architects and landscape architects working in Lenoir during this period included I.G. Taschereau and architect Beamer Clifford Harrell, as well as landscape architect Doan Reber Ogden. The house and grounds of the Aileen and William Stevens House at 153 Hillhaven Place was completed in 1963, and they were designed by Ashi Taschereau, who is a Japanese-American architect and landscape architect. Taschereau was born in Rhode Island and studied landscape architecture at the University of Cincinnati. In 1939, he was offered a position at Appalachian State University, then the State Teachers College in Boone. And during World War II, he evaded internment and spent a few years here in Lenoir. And after the war, he formed a firm in Hickory with another architect, D. Carroll Albee. And it was during this period that he earned his architectural license. So in addition to the Stevens House, Taschereau completed many residential, commercial, and public projects in Lenoir. And Hickory architect Beamer Clifford Harrell designed the ranch house at 301 High Brighton in 1961. Harrell graduated from Georgia Tech and practiced architecture in Hickory for 55 years. The Leslie Hines Jr. House at 508 College Avenue is a colonial residence built in 1965. The initial landscape design for the house was by Asheville landscape architect Doan Reber Ogden, a prominent designer and teacher in Western North Carolina in the second half of the 20th century. And the Asheville Regional Archive has his collection, and we were able to cross-reference that collection with this survey work, which was a fun aspect of the project. And so we have Ogden's plans for the Hines House here, and you can see he took advantage of the sloping front lawn and framed it by curved beds. He designed a retaining wall that separated the yard from the sidewalk and put a curved concrete path to the front door. In the backyard, he had a curved brick retaining wall that separated the lawn and patio area from the motor court. And his planting plan, we know, called for more than 36 types of trees, shrubs, and other flowers. And while the as-built design is unknown, certain elements that appeared in Ogden's plans are still evident today. So this wraps up the presentation, but before we open up the floor to questions, I just want to say that it has been such a pleasure to work in Lenoir, and everyone has been extremely helpful, and to all the local survey committee members and city staff who were able to provide assistance with this. I'm really grateful for that. And for all of the homeowners who I knocked on your door and you answered my questions about your house, thank you for that as well.
Thank you, Daria. That was beautifully done within the time allotted. I can't believe you covered all of that in an hour, actually a little less than an hour.
You mentioned the survey committee, and I forgot to talk about the survey committee when I was introducing this presentation. I know we have a few members of the survey committee here. If you are on the survey committee, could you raise your hand or stand up just to let people know that we've got Miss Sylvia here. I know Beverly Beal is here and is on the survey committee. Just so you know, the survey committee represents a broad range of interests in the community and has met a couple of times to help inform the survey work that Robinson has done, that the staff there have done, so that it is not just an outside consultant coming in and looking at a town and its architecture, but so that their work is informed by local priorities so that we at the State Historic Preservation Office know what's of value to you. And the survey committee has reviewed the draft report, and I will be working with the survey committee more intensively over the next couple of months as we work through the next steps for this project. As I mentioned earlier, we will be providing the feedback on the survey report to Daria and her team over the next week or so. Following that, we will be looking at the broad range of resources that were surveyed. She mentioned over 350 properties were looked at. Now, we assess which of those properties might be potentially eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Quick show of hands. Who does not know what the National Register of Historic Places is? Fantastic. It seems as though everybody here has heard of it, or lives in a property that is National Register listed, or has a store downtown in the National Register Historic District. The National Register is a program of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., and it's essentially the listing, the resources identified by the National Park Service as being historically significant and perhaps worthy of preservation. But just because something isn't on the National Register doesn't mean it's not important. It just means it might not meet those specific qualities or standards or threshold set by the Park Service, or it hasn't been evaluated yet. And that's the case with most of the buildings in Lenoir. The National Register doesn't have any impact on what a property owner can do with a property, but it is a way to highlight, to document historic significance and the value of a resource for generations to come. And so one part of a survey project here in North Carolina one of the last parts of a survey project, is to assess what resources might be eligible for listing and to get them placed on our state's National Register study list. And so coming in January and February, that's the next step for this process. We'll be looking at individual resources, houses, industrial resources, churches, that might meet the National Register eligibility standards. In addition, we'll be looking at neighborhoods or collections of resources that might be eligible as National Register historic districts. So that's the next step of this process. We will, toward the end of this project, which will wrap up at the end of February, we'll be scheduling some more community meetings. The National Register of Historic Places is a great program highlighting historic significance, but it also makes properties eligible for rehabilitation tax credits. And Jennifer Cathy, in my office in Asheville, who I mentioned earlier, has consulted a number of times on properties here in Lenoir that are already listed in the National Register. She's working on a project right now downtown where the property owner is pursuing rehabilitation tax credits. So as we look at adding to the National Register listings here in Lenoir, this is a program that might be of benefit to property owners whose houses or commercial buildings might be eligible for listing in the National Register. It's important to note that this process will not actually list properties in the National Register, but it takes this first step of identifying what properties might be eligible. And at this point, we can take questions for Daria on the survey presentation, or for me about the work of the State Historic Preservation Office, or for Jenny in the Planning Office if anybody has any questions. We'll take them now. And I think we've got to get Daria on the road by 7:30? By 7:30, because she's got a flight out from Charlotte tonight. So we're going to try to wrap this up here in the next 10 to 15 minutes. If there are any questions? Yes?
How can you find out if your house is surveyed? One of the houses in this was just across the street from mine, but I don't know if my house is surveyed.
I'm so glad you asked, because I completely forgot at the beginning of the presentation to talk about the sign-up sheet that I've got at the front. If you want more information, I've got 2 sign-up sheets. You can leave me your name, your address, and an email, and I can follow up. If you just want to write on it, was my house surveyed? Give me your address, and I will follow up with you. And Jenny's getting the sign-in sheets. You don't have to sign in, but if you want more information about the project, if you want to stay in the loop on the community meetings that will be taking place on the National Register and Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, please sign in, give me your name and some contact information, and I'll make sure that you're aware of the next steps as we keep this project going forward.